In this video, I'm going to talk about Tybalt from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. These are just some suggestions of some quotes that you might want to use or some aspects of his character that you might want to explore should he come up in a future exam. So first of all, let's start with his name, Tybalt. He shares the name with Tybalt or Tibbert the cat from Reynard the fox. So this character, this cat, is very cunning, takes advantage of situations for personal gain. You could argue we see that in Tybalt. As an example, in Act 3, Scene 1, Tybalt is very cunning in killing Mercutio. He makes the most of a moment when Romeo gets in the way and blocks Mercutio and slyly kills him, basically. You could also talk about how manipulative Tybalt is, okay? He antagonises Benvolio into fighting with him in Act 1, Scene 1. He does the same with Romeo eventually in Act 3, Scene 1 as well. So there's an element of that as well. Also, just think about kind of the characteristics of a cat, okay? They're predatory, they're territorial. I haven't mentioned this here, but he is referred to as the Prince of Cats by Mercutio in Act 3, Scene 1, so you could raise that as well. But this really reflects, being likened to a cat, reflects Tybalt's antagonistic behaviour, but also his commitment to defending his family's honour. Think about how territorial he is in Act 1, Scene 5, when he spots Romeo at the Capulets' party. So instantly, he is established as this really bloodthirsty character, and for that reason, he's established as the antagonist of the play. That's really important because Shakespeare doesn't want you to like him, and we're encouraged to dislike him right at the beginning, and that becomes even more important later on in Act 3, Scene 1, when Romeo kills Tybalt. And I think Shakespeare doesn't want us to like him really because he wants the audience to be able to justify Romeo murdering Tybalt, essentially. And let's face it, what we do is we watch Romeo do that and we might go, oh, you're so stupid, why did you do that, why did you get roped in? But there's another part of us that thinks, oh, Tybalt was asking for it. Okay, and that's because of some of the things that we see from him. So at the beginning, Act 1, Scene 1, he says to Benvolio, "Turn thee, Benvolio, look upon thy death." In Act 3, Scene 1, we see kind of parallels with his behaviour, turn and draw. So in both instances, Tybalt directly challenges Benvolio and Romeo to fight using the imperatives turn, look, turn again, and draw. By referring to himself as an embodiment of death, look upon thy death, he's referring to himself as death. He creates an intensely threatening tone, and this foreshadows the violence and, of course, the death that he will bring to the play. He's a dramatic foil to both characters, both Benvolio and Romeo, because in both instances when he shares the stage with them, they are trying to keep the peace. So that helps make Tybalt look even worse. It makes us dislike him even more because he's not just bloodthirsty, he's trying to push those that want to keep the peace into violence. So we have Benvolio saying, "I do but keep the peace," and we have Romeo saying, "Love thee better than thou canst devise." So real contrast between Benvolio and Romeo's character, with Tybalt being so violent and antagonistic. So think about the context here. The Elizabethan audience would revel in violence on stage. Some of Shakespeare's most violent plays were his most popular, so keep that in mind. So even though we would feel quite nervous if we were original members of the audience, we would have kind of a nervous excitement when we see Tybalt on stage. I haven't written this here, but also bear in mind that the Elizabethan audience would be a bit more desensitised to violence in real life, okay? This is the time of public hanging, being hung, drawn and quartered, okay? So members of the Elizabethan audience potentially would have been exposed to much more violence in person than we do. We see a lot of violence on TV and in the movies, but I don't necessarily think we are exposed to that kind of violence in everyday life. And a member of the Elizabethan audience may see violence much more. So keep that in mind as well. He's masculine in accordance to the Elizabethan views of what it was to be masculine, okay? He calls Benvolio a coward. he calls Romeo a boy when they want to keep the peace. So calling them a coward and a boy for attempting to keep the peace reveals that Tybalt believes his aggression proves his masculinity. So masculinity goes hand in hand with violence. And if you're not violent and you cower away from it, then you're not a man. At least that's the way he sees it. So is he mirroring the way that the Elizabethan audience would have viewed men at that time? He speaks in exclamatory sentences as well. So he intends to provoke them into fighting again. He's very, very antagonistic. But it's worth bearing in mind, and I haven't put this in the context slide on the next one, so just think, so maybe make some notes on this. Just because it's a more violent society doesn't mean it was okay just to go out onto the streets and fight anyone and kill anyone, and that showed that you were a man. It wasn't violence to that extent. It had to be justified violence, and we see Tybalt do that in Act 1, Scene 5 when he sees Romeo at the Capulet party. He says, "By the stock and honour of my kin, to kill him I do not see a sin." In other words, he's saying, my actions will be justified in killing him because I'll be defending my family's honour. This is my manly duty. This is one that will be forgiven by God. But Lord Capulet, however, calls him a saucy boy. Now, I'm sure you had lots of giggles in class when you read that. It doesn't mean quite the same thing now as it did then. He's basically saying that he's being petulant, okay? He's being silly. He's being really arrogant and immature. So he's really belittling Tybalt's masculinity at this point. And Lord Capulet's level-headedness when seeing Romeo and thinking, well, actually, I've heard really good things about him. He seems like a nice person. We're not going to do anything. This raises the question of how a real man should behave. Should they be so violent and aggressive like Tybalt, or should they be much more level-headed and moderate like Lord Capulet? And I think through this contrast, Shakespeare is encouraging the audience to think about that question of what it really is to be a man. Who is the real man in this instance? Keep in mind maybe the pressure on Tybalt. So rather than having this one-dimensional idea of Tybalt just being this evil person, think about the times, and is he a victim of the times and the pressure put on a man, a young man? So dueling was very much intertwined with honour. He was, remember, a member of the nobility. So he would have had to he would maybe feel constant pressure to protect his honour, not just his own honour, but the honour of his family. And one way of losing that honour would be to be viewed as a coward. And the best way to avoid being considered a coward was not only to step up to a challenge, but to constantly challenge others as well. So you might argue Tybalt feels that societal pressure to constantly prove himself, that he is man enough, that he is masculine. That is one way of looking at Tybalt. Is he loyal to his family, or is he a victim of them? And this is really being much more critical and therefore getting those higher marks. So have a look at some of these quotations. I hate the word being peace, as I hate hell, all Montagues, and thee being Benvolio. So the repetition of hate emphasises how deeply entrenched Tybalt's hatred is. So does this present him as a one-dimensional evil character, which I think is much easier to explain away? Or if you want to get those higher marks, would you argue that actually this reveals that he has been institutionalized by his family feud? Okay, he's incapable of any other emotion because he's just grown up in this world of hate, of vengeance, of vindictiveness. And we see this again in Act 1, Scene 5. Remember, he has seen Romeo at the Capulet ball. And he says, this intrusion shall now, seeming sweet, convert to bitter gall. So he's not going to let go of this. Lord Capulet has told him not to start a fight, but he's saying basically, I'm not going to forget about this. I will avenge Romeo later, and he will in Act 3, Scene 1. So the feud has made Tybalt territorial and vengeful. He has become a symbol of the family grudge. As the families have held this ancient grudge, so does Tybalt have a tendency for vindictiveness. Remember, he's grown up in a world where he has seen the adults in his family hold grudges and never let go. And that's what he's doing with Romeo. He's seen Romeo at the Capulet Ball. How dare he be here? How dare he trespass? I'm not going to let this go, because I've never seen any adult in my life let go of a grudge. And then think about what he says here about it converting to bitter gall. So his hatred is deep, like bile in the gallbladder. That's what gall is. Okay, so again, it highlights how deeply entrenched this hatred is. It's in his blood. He's incapable of reacting or behaving in a different way. It's how he's been brought up. It's what he's seen all his life. So this is, you might say, he is living proof of the relentlessness of a grudge, emphasising that this feud can only end with the tragic loss of Romeo and Juliet. And that was foreshadowed, wasn't it, in the prologue? And we're seeing that proof, okay? He's a symbol of the younger generation as well. And he is holding on to this grudge with both hands. So there's no way that this is ever going to end unless something really tragic changes that. And that will happen through the suicides of Romeo and Juliet. This also helps build tension because now we know that Tybalt is out for Romeo. So whenever we see Tybalt on stage, we're going to feel really unsettled. And it will foreshadow that he will play a part in Romeo and Juliet's downfall. And of course he does, because by Romeo killing Tybalt, Romeo's banished, and therefore Romeo and Juliet are led to their suicides. Also think about the way he views Romeo. Thou art a villain. He's dehumanising Romeo, and it's dramatic irony because the audience haven't seen anything like a villain in Romeo. We've seen this incredibly sensitive character. So the way that Tybalt is describing Romeo is the antithesis of what they have seen themselves. Okay, this character who mopes around, he's a lover, he's not a fighter. So this really highlights how meaningless the rift is between the two households, because Tybalt clearly has no idea of the character of Romeo. It's the complete opposite to the way he thinks. And again, that just really highlights how silly this feud is and how they really don't know each other. So could you link this to the feud in the family of the Queen? So at that point, Queen Elizabeth I was the Queen. But we've got to keep in mind, Henry VIII was her father, and he left the Roman Catholic Church to found the Church of England. When he dies, his oldest daughter Mary was a Catholic, so she changes everything to Catholicism again. When Mary dies, Queen Elizabeth is a Protestant. She changes everything back to being a Protestant. And then on top of that, we also have Queen Elizabeth's Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who's threatening a civil war to take the throne. So basically, we've got this really complicated family that have this feud within them, especially in terms of religion, whether it be Catholicism or being a Protestant. But because of that, we have thousands of deaths. So is this Shakespeare highlighting how these feuds create deaths amongst the innocent? Okay, that's one way of looking at it. So here's another one. I see this all the time, that Tybalt is presented as a skilled fighter. Be critical of this, okay? Is he a skilled fighter, or actually is he much more contrived? In other words, is he much more of a show-off? Is it all for show? Does he do all the right moves, but actually, when you really break it down, he's not actually that great of a fighter? And there's reason for this. So first of all, you could look at this quotation. This is a very long quote, so you'd want to condense this, by Mercutio at 3 Scene 1. And many people use this to support this idea that he's a skilled fighter. It says he fights as you sing prick song, keeps time, distance and proportion. He rests his minim rests, 1, 2 and the third in your bosom. The very butcher of a silk button, a duellist, a gentleman of the very first house, of the first and second cause. Ah, the immortal passado, the punter reverse of the hay, and goes on. And as always, Mercutio always goes on. The simile describes Tybalt as fighting with great accuracy, and the use of expert terminology, this being the immortal passado, the punto reverso, suggests he is a technical fighter. So there's many things in this quotation that suggest he's a very skilled fighter, even things like the idea that he's so accurate that he can butcher off someone's button. Okay, and we've kind of seen that with Zorro, okay, this idea that it all looks very fancy and then the shirt falls off because he's been that accurate, okay, you can read it in that way. However, if you want to get those higher marks, critically analyse that. As an example, in Act 1, Scene 1, Benvolio says, and this is talking about Tybalt, he swung about his head and cut the winds, who nothing hurt withal hissed him in scorn. So this suggests Benvolio actually is unimpressed by Tybalt, who seems really just to wave his sword in the air, and he hurts nobody. So again, it's this sense that actually it's all for show. And then Mercutio again says, courageous captain of compliments, a villain that fights by the book of arithmetic. These are both from Act 3, Scene 1. Here, Mercutio claims that Tybalt is not a natural fighter, but one who is more ceremonious, as emphasised through the alliteration, courageous captain of compliments. This idea that he's just putting on this show is very contrived. He says all the right things, he does all the right moves, but it's all very fancy, and it's all basically just pomp. He says that Tybalt fights like he's following a step-by-step guide on arithmetic. Think, this actually parallels with what Juliet said about Romeo kissing by the book. And you can read that in two ways. Either Romeo's an amazing kisser, or he's kissing as if he read about it. And you could argue that that's what Mercutio is saying, that he's not a great fighter. He's fighting as if he's reading a guide. So remember, Tybalt only kills Mercutio because Romeo gets in the way of Mercutio, okay? So Mercutio, you might argue, didn't get a fair fight with Tybalt, and Tybalt would never potentially have been able to kill Mercutio had Romeo not got in the way. So there is an argument here to suggest that he is all show, and I think to critically analyse this idea that he's a skilled fighter would really get you top marks. So think about how fashionable fencing was at this time. So fencing was very fashionable sport at the time, so the audience would appreciate the references to fencing terminology used by Mercutio. The actors would have to be skilled fencers to create a convincing fight scene to the trained eye. The audience would definitely be watching to see if Tybalt really was just all pomp, or was he actually a really good fighter. So then I want you to think, really, if you want to get those high marks, you've got to keep bringing this back to the intentions of Shakespeare. When you're asked a character question, you don't want to just focus on the character. You want to think about the person who constructed that character and for what reason. And of course, that is Shakespeare. So, Tybalt is used for many reasons. He shifts the tone from comedic and or romantic to a much more intense moment, and that helps create a sense of impending doom. Remember, overall, this is a tragedy, but there are moments when this play feels like a comedy, and Tybalt's really useful in creating that shift back, especially in Act 3, Scene 1 with Mercutio. Because remember, Mercutio is a source of comedic relief. Tybalt comes and helps intensify that scene in Act 3, Scene 1. Like a typical antagonist. Oh, I don't know why I put she. It's definitely he. He is a catalyst. He helps pave the way to Romeo and Juliet's tragic downfall by antagonising Romeo into fighting. Another example of extreme behaviour. Shakespeare is encouraging modesty in everything. So you might argue that's the overall lesson to be learnt from Romeo and Juliet. We see extreme behaviour in Mercutio. We see it in Romeo. We see it in Juliet. We see it in the two families who won't let go of this grudge. So is Shakespeare saying it's better to live your life modestly than to be extreme in any way? And that includes in the way you love when you look at Romeo and Juliet. He's a symbol of the feud and how the younger generation are affected by mindless grudges. And in this sense, you could paint him to be a victim of the times because of the pressure on him as a man to prove his masculinity, but also a victim of his family. He doesn't know any different. He's been institutionalized by his family to hate. And that's why he seems so one-dimensional, because his family haven't been good enough role models for him. So those are some ideas. I definitely haven't included everything. I do love it when students comment, or teachers comment and offer their own ideas as well in the comment section. So feel free to share your own ideas as well.